Aurora, the stone counter. In a small village hidden deep in the mountains of Greece, there was a hill that no one dared to climb. The villagers warned travelers never to step onto that hill, and above all, never to count the stones that lay there. They claimed that those who counted the stones never returned. And if they did, they were no longer the same. Elios Kostas, an archaeologist specializing in ancient Greek ruins, became fascinated by the legend. He had long believed that folk tales often had roots in real historical events, and this story intrigued him. Despite the villagers' warnings, he dismissed their words as superstition and set off alone toward the hill. The path leading up was narrow and rugged, with jagged rocks exposed beneath his feet. As he ascended, the air grew colder. Though the summer sun burned brightly overhead, an unnatural chill seeped into his bones as he neared the summit. When he finally reached the top, he froze. Countless stones were arranged in a pattern, small ones, large ones, all placed with eerie precision. They looked like grave markers, yet there were no inscriptions, no names, only silence. Elios took out his notebook and began recording his observations. Then, almost instinctively, he started counting the stones. 1, 2, 3. With each number, a strange weight seemed to settle around him. 14, 15, 16. The wind stopped. Not just the wind. All sound vanished. His own breathing, his heartbeat, everything fell into a vacuum of silence, as if the world itself had been swallowed by something unseen. Then, rustle. A faint shifting sound. Elios stiffened. Slowly, he lowered his gaze. Beneath one of the stones, a finger was sticking out. Pale, dry, covered in dirt, but it was moving. A sickening realization gripped him. This was no graveyard. This was something far worse. Then, from the gaps between the stones, more fingers began to emerge. One by one, they twitched and groped at the air, as if reaching for something. Rustle. Rustle. A stone tumbled over. Elios turned his head and saw an arm crawling out from beneath the pile. It was skeletal, the flesh cracked and dry. Then the stones shifted further, and something lifted its face. It had no eyes, no mouth, yet it was watching him. Panic surged through Elios. He staggered back, but the ground beneath him was no longer solid. Its entire hill was moving. The stones trembled, and the figures buried beneath them began to rise. This was no burial site. It was a seal. A place where the ancient dead had been trapped, not laid to rest, and counting the stones had been the key to waking them. Elios turned to flee, but then his shadow disappeared. Not behind him, not beneath him. It simply vanished. A second later, something pulled him down. A force, stronger than any human grip, yanked him backward. He screamed, clawing at the ground. But dozens of hands, cold, dry, hungry, dragged him into the stones. The earth opened its mouth and swallowed him whole. Then, silence returned. Days later, the villagers came looking for him. There was no trace of Elios, but among the countless stones, one new and unknown stone had appeared. The village elder sighed, looking at it with sorrow. Another one joins them. No one dared to touch it. The woman at the night market. In a city in Taiwan, there were rumors of a strange night market, one that was unlike any other. Night markets were common across the country, bustling with people, neon lights, and the scent of sizzling street food. But this one was different. Those who entered it never returned, and if they did, they were no longer the same. Joe, a traveler, was visiting the city. Exploring night markets was his passion, and every evening he wandered through different districts, sampling the local delicacies. One night, while chatting with some locals, he overheard a warning. "This city has many great night markets," one of them said. "But whatever you do, never go past the South Gate. There's another market there." Joe was intrigued and pressed for details, but the locals refused to say more. They quickly changed the subject, their faces suddenly pale. Later that night, Joe walked through the lively night market as usual. The streets were filled with chatter, the scent of grilled skewers and fried dough floating through the air. But his eyes were searching for something else. The shucked South Gate. Eventually, he found it, a narrow alleyway leading beyond the main street. At the end of the alley, he saw dim lights flickering. Another market. Curiosity got the better of him, and he stepped through. The alley seemed longer than expected, and as he walked, the sounds of the bustling market behind him faded. When he turned to look back, the South Gate was gone. Ahead, the dimly lit night market stretched before him, but something was wrong. There were stalls lined up just like any other market, but there were no customers. Vendors sat behind their carts, silent and still. Their faces were blank, their expressions unreadable. Then he noticed her. A woman in a red chipao, standing beside a food stall. Her long black hair cascaded down her back, and she smiled as he approached. "Would you like to try some?" She held out a small bamboo cup filled with clear soup. Joe hesitated. Something about the woman unsettled him, but his curiosity won. He took the spoon, scooped up the soup, and drank. The moment it touched his tongue, the world twisted. The market lights blurred. The shadows around him deepened. The vendors, all at once, turned to face him. Their faces were like masks. No eyes, no noses, just wide, gaping mouths stretched unnaturally across their skin. The spoon fell from his hand. "Did you like it?" The woman in red was still smiling, but her lips had never moved. The voice, it was inside his head. Joe stumbled backward. The vendors were rising to their feet, moving toward him. He turned and ran. The market stretched endlessly in all directions. No matter which way he ran, he only found more stalls, more vendors, more shadows waiting. Then, in the distance, a red gate. The South Gate. Joe sprinted toward it with everything he had. He leaped through, and suddenly, he was back. The lively sounds of the normal night market surrounded him. The familiar sense of food, the bright lights, the warm hum of human voices. Panting, he turned around. The alley was gone. For a moment, he thought he had imagined it. Then he saw her, the woman in red, standing among the crowd, watching him. He fled to his hotel that night and never returned to another night market. But even after he left Taiwan, something followed him. One evening, he glanced at the mirror in his home, and there she was, standing behind him, smiling. He never turned around, but every night he heard her whisper in his ear, "Did you like it?" The fog carriage. There was a rumor about the London Underground, one that only surfaced among late-night commuters and train workers. They spoke of a night train carriage that shouldn't exist, a carriage that only appeared past midnight, and those who stepped inside it never returned. And if they did, they were no longer the same. Edward had heard the story before, but he dismissed it as just another urban legend. He was a train enthusiast, someone who loved exploring old stations and lesser-known railway routes. One night, as the final trains of the evening were departing, he decided to see for himself if the Marion Diadrita, the vanishing carriage, was real. The platform was nearly deserted. A train slid into the station, its headlights casting eerie reflections on the tiled walls. Edward carefully scanned the cars before stepping into the last carriage at the far end. The doors shut. The train pulled away. Then he noticed something strange. The carriage was completely empty. Not unusual for the last train of the night, but something felt off. The windows were slightly fogged, making it hard to see outside. As the train entered a tunnel, a thin mist seemed to seep into the carriage for just a second. Then, a figure stood at the far end of the car. Edward froze. There had been no one when he entered. The figure was barely visible in the dim light, but it was unmistakably staring at him. He took a step back and pressed the button to open the doors to the next carriage. Nothing happened. Then the train curved sharply around a bend. The lights flickered, and suddenly, the figure was standing right beside him. Edward's breath caught in his throat. Something was wrong. The figure was wearing his exact outfit, like a mirror image, but its face, there was something off about its face. The figure's mouth twitched upward, forming a slight, unnatural smile. Then it whispered something. Edward couldn't hear it, or rather, there was no sound at all. The noise of the train, the hum of the lights, even his own breathing, everything had vanished. The figure kept staring at him. Then its face began to distort. The skin stretched unnaturally. Its eyes sank deeper into its skull, and its mouth widened, splitting open as if its face was being peeled away. Edward turned and pounded on the doors. Through the window, he saw a station, but he didn't recognize the name. The speakers crackled to life, announcing the station stop. The voice that came through wasn't human. It was a sound like mist scraping against glass, a whisper that carried no words. The train stopped abruptly. The doors slid open. Edward bolted. But there was no platform. Only fog. An endless void of swirling, shifting mist. Then, behind him, the door shut. He turned back. Inside the train, someone was standing where he had been. It was himself. The figure smirked, then disappeared into the mist as the train pulled away. The next morning, station workers reviewed the final CCTV footage of the night. One clip stood out, a man stepping onto the platform from the last train, but he had no shadow. Without speaking to anyone, he walked calmly through the station and vanished into the streets. Edward was never seen again, but sometimes, late at night, passengers claimed to see a foggy reflection in the train windows, a figure standing alone, and if you look closely, it looks exactly like Edward.